So welcome to Lancefield on the Line. My name's David Lancefield. I'm delighted to welcome Diana Wu David from Hong Kong, a future of work strategist, keynote speaker, founder of Future Proofs Labs, a best-selling author of the same name, Future Proof, Reinventing Work in the Age of Acceleration, and anything else. Wow, how do you pack it in? But welcome, Diana, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, David. It's nice to be speaking to you.
Yeah, indeed. And we also share the fact that we have a history in PwC, which is nice, some time ago for you at least,
Yes.
and for me. So we at least have that shared bond, and we have a shared interest in these topics. And today we are going to talk about the future, resilience, reinvention, and I'm particularly fascinated, given you've lived and worked in different worlds, getting that sort of cross-cultural perspective that some of us don't always get. So, but I do want to start with future-proof. That concept of future-proof, because it's features all over your work, right? And some people have said, hey, you know what? The last year has just been really tough, loads of uncertainty, fragility, all those words. How can we possibly future-proof either our organizations or ourselves as individuals? What do you say to that?
Well, I think that future-proof doesn't mean we find, the perfect equation that allows us to never have to change and to sort of hunker down. It's not a bunker, but it is really about understanding that that's going to be the new pace of change, and that in order to do your best work, you have to understand what is going to be really core so that you can flex around the edges. And of course, mindset, it is a big one. And I know Margaret Heffernan on your show had discussed that as well, and being comfortable with ambiguity. But I think for me, it's a lot about how do you do that? So I think we can all be, I guess, be held responsible for saying, you just have to be comfortable with ambiguity. And it's sort of this vague term, and you're like, am I there yet?
Yeah. What does that mean?
But when I did my book, actually, Future Proof, it was in response to people saying, what does that mean? How do I start?
So so just to be clear, so people might get the concept you described, either they verbalize it or get it, but actually translating into, so what do I do differently or think differently tomorrow, the next day? That was the challenge.
Absolutely. That's why I wrote the book, because I was surrounded by people, in particular, senior leaders who were saying, things are changing. What am I supposed to do? So somebody that interviewed me when it launched described it as the parkour circuit for lateral thinking. So one of those things where you run around the park and there's a little thing, you do to do leg lifts, and then, little exercises that kind of build your muscle for agility and reinvention.
Yeah, I like that concept. And how long does it take? I'm not looking for a date.
Forever.
But is this forever?
You're here the rest of your life.
It's like the concept of organizational transformation. I hear some people say, oh, you know what, once you have a new leader, she or he can set a new strategy, and then 6 months in, you transformed. I exaggerate, but not that far off. But transformations take years, decades, if it happens at all. In your work with people, whether your coaching work or the course you run, how long is it years, or can people start to practically change the way they're thinking about the future and the now in months?
Yeah, I think that what they can change is the fear of change. So I like to give people tools that they can, and they do sort of that first layer of change. And oftentimes, in the senior people I work with, they've been so successful that the fear is trying something new that I'm not gonna, that's not catering to all the things I've done before, and looking like a fool, and all of those things that are deep-seated. And so just doing small exercises that build up confidence to go outside of your comfort zone, I think builds on, it builds on whatever you've done, whatever practice, whatever experiment you've done in the past. So it's I guess a perpetual transformation, welcome to life. It's not as much of an A to B. And the other thing I feel super passionate about and I started a future-proof course around it, is the community aspect. So
Yes.
it's about the work that you do to be more comfortable with change and ambiguity and have a muscle for experimentation. But it's also creating a community and a sort of safe space for people to say, hey, I think I'm going to try this. Let
Mm.
me do it in a small group and get some feedback so I can then launch it into the world.
That's incredibly powerful. I felt, I mean, having spent nearly 25 years in one organization, I mean, if I said that to somebody in their 20s, they'd laugh at me, but I actually had a great time. But then the transition to whatever you want to call it, portfolio life, solopreneur, you do feel exposed, asking questions, thinking, actually, I'm like an apprentice again. So having a community around you where you can ask, and I'm reasonably comfortable, but you can ask silly questions without somebody thinking, he shouldn't be asking that. He should know the answer. But going back to tools then, and let's get personal for a moment. Which tool have you personally found most helpful of you as you've done your own work in this area?
Because I did this transition from being a corporate exec for 20 years, focused on disruption, to transitioning to a portfolio career. I think I've tried everything that I mentioned in the book
Right.
at one point or another.
No.
And I thought that I was pretty adept at changing, but actually, one of the things I did that has worked really well is to get a longer term view. So, as somebody who loves emerging technology and always loves the future, I think that that's easy. But for example, storytelling, I knew I wanted to get better at that. And I literally left my job at Financial Times thinking, okay, who knows how long I have on this earth. Some of these projects, if Malcolm Gladwell is right, takes 10,000 hours, could take 10 years. What do I want to spend, 2 or 3 things mastering? And one of them was storytelling. And so that long-term kind of lighthouse thinking allowed me to say yes to the TEDx, which wasn't really, I hadn't done any speaking per se. And then yes to a speaking career that came after it, and yes to writing a book when an agent came after that. And it's allowed me to say no to other things because I keep thinking, I want to get good at storytelling and I have 10 or 20 years to do it. So what are the interesting experiments that are along that line?
I love that. And there's a lot of courage in that. And getting on a stage like a TEDx, I mean, I've done one, not as good as yours, clearly, having seen both and being self-critical, but you have to put yourself out there. And it's easy to say, but when you're experienced, saying, okay, I may, I'll do the work and I'll practice and so on, but actually it may work, it may not work. It's interesting on the storytelling front. That's something that I've been exploring and I'm going to be getting some help with, but I've done it and I do it reasonably well. But actually, I've been looking at myself sort of afresh and think, you know what? Actually, I've had great people around me. When you're in a big organization, there are amazing people. But sometimes you don't need to be the best at something. When you're an individual, you're more exposed in some ways. So if storytelling is important, which it is in my case and our case, I sort of thought, actually, perhaps I need to go back to school. I mean, school in inverted commas. And once you get over yourself, as I call it, once you get over yourself, and say, well, I'm not amazing at everything, actually it's quite liberating because you can actually start learning, that learning mindset again. But just going back to organizations, and we talked about individuals, but organizations, you talk about an anti-fragile organization. I love your terminology in terms, which is fantastic. And we need a few of those. If you think about leaders right now, then the leaders who hopefully have managed the, if they're still in their post, managed the crisis, built some resilience in the organization. But they should be having some foresight, thinking, okay, how do we continue, sustain, how do we manage the next set of crises? Because there are other crises around, like the climate, socioeconomic issues and so on. What do you mean by an anti-fragile organization? And what would they need to build in terms of capabilities to actually make that happen?
Well, I've spent a huge amount of time speaking to companies about what they can do now, because a crisis is the best moment, or maybe just before a crisis, is a good moment to start thinking about the capabilities that you need to put in place to be an organization that basically learns from stress, that gets stronger by undergoing the stress of COVID, or in Asia, there are a lot of companies like Toyota, which
Yes.
during the tsunami had all of its parts cut off from that area. I can't remember
Yes.
what automobile part it was.
Yes.
And so they went and designed a database of all the suppliers in that area that were competitors even to some of its suppliers, so that it could smooth capacity for
Right.
any inevitable, you know, problems with supply chain. And now we're talking about supply chains in different parts of the world being disrupted at 3.7 years. One of the consulting firms had said that. So
Right. Right.
that's an example, I would say, of, we went through that. We learned that we couldn't make cars anymore because of this one little area in Japan.
Yeah.
And we developed a way to be um, part of an ecosystem so that we could basically flex under pressure.
So having more resilience, under future pressure. At the same time,
Yeah.
I've seen some leaders who perhaps haven't got the patience or foresight to do what you just described, and once the crisis is over, whatever the crisis or challenge is, and who knows what over means, but they've decided it's over. In a way, either just muddle on, or want to forget it, or want to just candidly have a break. That doesn't mean they necessarily stop working, but sort of just calm
Yeah.
things down.
No.
What is it? What stops people doing that in your experience? The people who have looked at the supply chain in that in Toyota's case, what if is it their mindset? Is it their grit to avoid just slipping back to old ways, or just saying, hey, let's just pause for a bit? Because I imagine that will be on the minds of some leaders. I mean, they spent 6 months, 12 months longer, working all hours under intense scrutiny, and once the
Yeah.
sort of it stops, I'm curious as to what the reactions could be, in terms of either building a stronger, more resilient, more anti-fragile organization, or actually just some of them would just say,
Enough already.
yeah, enough,
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah. I think it's sometimes it's the small things. So one of the apparel companies here, for instance, is that the head of Asia Pacific is having Zoom meetings with the folks just directly reporting to him, and sometimes the next one down,
Yeah.
where he walks through some of his ideas. And he says things like, okay, I don't know if this is the right way to go. I've never experienced this, but inevitably you will experience something like this in the future. So I'm going to try and be really transparent with you in my thinking. I'd
Nice.
like for you guys to give me ideas, because diversity of opinion
Mm.
will potentially reduce the risk and at least reduce our blind spots. And that's the kind of thing that, might have a profound effect on that organization, and
Yeah,
certainly
yeah,
on
yeah.
the leaders,
It's a different
because
it's a different set of relationships, isn't it? Because one of the things we have seen from the best leaders, um, many of them women by observation, both political and business, and there's clearly a lot's been read and spoken about that, is a greater degree of transparency and often honesty about, in the case of the challenges that the organization's facing. And the interesting thing then is how you take that sort of set of behaviors forward in the way you described, from we're in a crisis, let me tell you what's going on, what's in my mind, to it's a sort of norm as an organization. And that's encouraging that individual's doing that.
yeah. And some companies have, I mean, before COVID, I wrote my book last year. The entire preface was, things are changing, so we need to build in those capacities. We need to actually, attack our own systems. We need to think about what's important and what's not, and start to build those kind of things. So, like Netflix with Chaos Monkeys, the way that they attack their own system
Yes.
so that they're prepared for an attack. And one thing that I'm fascinated by is activist investors, for instance, were all over Samsung and Hyundai in
Yeah.
Korea,
Yes.
and then COVID hit, and all of a sudden they look like geniuses because they had great cash management. So I think that that's going to be something that people look at as we migrate from this somewhat fragile efficiency mindset to
Yes.
agility, which sometimes requires us to be to have, redundancies in the system or
Yes, yes,
flexibility in the
yes,
system
yes.
that isn't always as efficient as what, we grew up with at PwC,
Yeah.
certainly, with Six Sigma and procurement and all those kind of things.
And a touch of bureaucracy occasionally, but let's not go there. Gary Hamel's done enough on that topic. But it's interesting that I won't get to invited to any alumni events in the future if I carry on that topic. But it's interesting on the efficiency front, it gets away from, if you like, the predominant focus on, if you like, short-term metrics, which sort of says, we've got to squeeze, we've got to hit the targets, and actually sometimes it's in the leader's mindset of that sort of insecurity, that sort of short-termism, where actually the narrative can be, well, actually we're here for the medium term, the longer term. Let's put in some capacity, let's put in some capabilities, which may mean the short term we're not always the best on every single metric, but actually we're more sustainable. Because when you hear the examples, and you've quoted some, Samsung, Netflix, and so on, and I speak to some organizations that are perhaps less successful, less capital rich, more traditional, I think their mindset will be, oh, we don't have the space, or we don't have the luxury of doing all these anti-fragile things. That's just for the best in the organization. What would you say to them? The traditional organizations that perhaps are more susceptible to disruption, and they say, I can't do it, I've just got to keep managing the business really well. What would you say to an executive who came to you and said that?
Well, all of them do, right? That's what, that's Clayton Christensen and the Innovator's Dilemma. It's been
Indeed.
sort of the story of our era. And I grew up with being, usually in that tiny little innovation department in a gigantic company like Time Warner or similar, and trying to make that happen. And actually in consulting was in the tech, media, and telecom practice.
Yes,
And,
yes.
you would have this small piece of the business that was experimenting with things and thinking about how you might make the next cash cow, or how you could take just a little bit of money to experiment with different things that were really on the horizon as the next big possibility. So I don't think it takes much. And the interesting thing is now I see that being much more embedded in the organization, where people are being encouraged to take risks because
Yes.
company lifespans are decreasing. And in fact, you have each and every staff that companies are asking them to be more entrepreneurial and to feed in ideas and to be interdisciplinary, or at least interdepartmental. So
Yes, yeah. Going back to one of the things you said earlier, you talked about how your conversations and your courses that you help people translate the concepts that people get into sort of the practical reality. And you also said you're a bit of a tech, you love tech. And I wanted to come back to this sort of, in particular, the prospect of AI, where a lot of the commentary says, oh, well, AI, if it's used well, can complement human endeavor and actually can help humans, people, you and me, get back to what we do really well, which is exercise judgment, be creative, which are all laudable things. But I sort of think that goes in the same bucket as the previous conversation, which is, okay, so I'm going to have more space, and or I'm going to be encouraged, if not forced, to be more creative, exercise better judgment. What does that mean? What do I switch on creativity?
how do you measure it?
But I'm curious, given you work in that interplay in the future of work between tech and people, what do you say to that sort of challenge of how do you amplify the human capabilities in a world of artificial intelligence and other emerging tech?
Well, oftentimes I'm called upon to speak to companies about what the future might look like, and what they, as employees and staff and leaders, what their human role might be in that future.
Yes, yes.
And often they get it when they start thinking about, oh, it's actually, anybody who's managed people knows it's actually really hard to manage people. And, you never, that's the manager's comment. I don't have time for this. I have to do all this other stuff, right? What
Yes.
if you actually did have time to manage people?
Mhm.
And so people start to open their eyes to the idea that, making people feel like they belong as part of the organization and making them feel safe enough to share their ideas, that's a lot of heavy lifting, and it's
Yes.
very human.
Yeah.
Um,
And you
on
have
the
to
flip
support people, mate.
side,
That's quite a transition. Sorry to interrupt. That's quite a change and transition for people, and for the, I guess, the people with a positive mindset and I guess some courage will think, hey, I've always loved to do all these things, but it's all that repetitive stuff or that process stuff that gets in the way. But other people, I guess, may feel threatened and think, you know what, I'm going to be exposed now, because all those things that actually somebody else can do better, I've now got to use your Clay Christensen, I've got to move up the chain and do a better job, right? It stirs emotion. It's an emotional journey as much as a sort of transactional journey, I guess.
it really is. Absolutely. And thought it was really interesting that when MIT came out with their Work of the Future report last week, they actually said that robotics was overhyped. And they pointed out that the problems of inequality and labor policies were actually much more difficult and had much more impact on the labor force than AI and robotics and that kind of thing. So those are very human, problems. So I think that we'll have lots of work ahead of us.
I want to touch now on the if you like, we've talked about organizations and we've talked about leaders within them, but I want to sort of look at that nexus of leaders and individuals. We are human beings after all. And you've talked about moving a mindset from being sort of from success to significance. And you also talk about, if you like, running free rather than just running. That was the premise of your TED talk. And I think I get what you mean, but I'm particularly curious, if a little nosy, as to what you personally did. And the reason I'm just curious and I am nosy, but the reason I always ask people who sort of talk about these concepts to understand whether they actually try and practice them. Not to say they have to be the best at them, but you do find some people who write books, they give speeches and so on, and they're talking about everyone else, and they don't actually do it themselves. It's like a bit of integrity would be good. So tell us a little bit about success to significance, running free, and then a little bit about what you've done.
Okay, well, I think that often what I say is that I am the worst at it and have worked the hardest at it. And therefore,
false modesty, false modesty.
Therefore, I'm privileged to be able to help other people because I've tried just about anything. And I would say that you asked before, what are some of the practices? So one practice that was really helpful to me and that is proving to be very helpful to the folks in the Future Proof course, who are all very senior execs, is to really reflect on values and priorities. And so you were saying you've gone off on this track and you can learn all the time. And not one of the things that I realize is not everybody wants to learn all the time. It was an aha moment for me when I started really digging into what do I really want to spend my time doing, that I'd be happy to learn all the time. And so, that makes me able to choose projects and opportunities, knowing that that's always going to be a driver. And if it's not there, then I'm going to be miserable, no matter, how prestigious it is, et cetera. So I think that having those, that understanding of yourself and your values is really important. And in terms of running free, the idea is, at the beginning, I thought was work-life balance. And then when I interviewed 100 people and thought, how do they do this? They all look like they've gone off and they're doing interesting work and they're combining it in new ways. And what I found is that people were not looking for work-life balance in a way. They were more ambitious for themselves than people who had just tried to do, the sort of narrow path that.
So it wasn't about compromises per se and trying to get, but it was actually trying to create a better life for themselves and make more conscious choices to create a better life as a whole.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. It's sort of an on my terms, thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I would say, just on a very practical note, that I don't do that day by day. I try to do it year to year.
Right. Sure.
So in fact, every year I invite people on a retreat, and we are actually able to do that in Hong Kong. I just rented an eco farm so we can all be socially distant in different houses. But really thinking about what those important things that I want to have happen, both for my family, in terms of my own personal growth, in terms of my business, and then just make sure that those happen during the year.
So
But
these are people that you are close to and you trust, and then you talk about your respective plans for the year in your sort of group.
yeah, I lead them through a process so that,
Right.
but it's not me per se, it's getting a group of people
I see.
together um, to give you feedback and really think about. And there is some sort of scaffolding, I guess, so that you can't have. Somebody sent me a 240-page end of the year planner and said, "This is what I use," and I was like, "I can." It'd be like end of next year by the time that I figured it out. So I think everybody has their own process, but for me, I just looked back at this past year,
Yes.
and for all the times that I felt like I'm not doing enough, and there's all these things I didn't get to. The three things that I talked about last year are exactly the three things that I did, and so that is
It's
really helpful
fascinating.
because
So
you
you're,
can have work-life balance, but it has to be over like 100-year life.
yes, yeah, that's a good, yes, that's a good frame. Um, Decision making in that context, both at the year, every year, and then in the moment, becomes really important, right? To make sure that you stay true to your priorities, but also, I guess, don't become so stubborn that if there is a great opportunity in front of you, you don't take it. What is your own process? There is a process of decision making. How do you actually make decisions?
I try to go back to my goals for the year. And like the storytelling, they're not always very specific.
Yeah.
Um, for example, this year I knew that my parents were not doing well, and I knew that last year. So it's just to make
Sorry to
sure
hear.
that if that happens this year, to give them a good death. So that's pretty, all encompassing. It's a
Sure.
milestone in my life.
Sure.
Um, and I didn't know what that would mean, but I knew that that would be the priority. So, if there was a speech that if TED said, okay, now you can go on the TED stage, and it conflicted with me being there for my parents in any way, that it would be a no, even though that would be like a dream of mine to do that, because
Yes.
it can happen some other time.
Quite.
Um, but a lot of the things that you choose are things that need to happen, or that you want to prioritize happening in that moment.
Mm.
And so that's really helpful because for me, actually, I tend to want to do everything right now.
Right.
And
Okay.
of course, for this year, my plans, for instance, for speaking, I was in Shanghai in January for a big keynote, and then it all dissolved. But just knowing that it wasn't one of my priorities, and also I could try other things in anticipation of building it back up virtually, made it more interesting and
Hmm.
and maybe a little easier.
I love the fact that you know, you're clear on your foundations. You come across as though you're clear on your foundations of what important. In that case, obviously, your parents, but what's important to you, and you're conscious about choices. Um, I guess the question, as we draw to a close, I guess the question I have is, you've done some amazing things already, no doubt, and I'm curious about what next year has in store. And we'll maybe touch on that before we leave. But creating, if you like, high performance whilst not having what I call collateral damage. This is a shameless plug, a recent topic of my HBR article, where I've interviewed and spent time with leaders who talk in the ways we've talked about, make clear goals, conscious choices, look after themselves. But it's all about the candidate. It's all about them. And they say, oh, yes, but yes, I have hobbies and I have friends and family. And if you actually look at it, they don't, or they're damaged, or they don't have enough time. So in a way, they talk about this nirvana that doesn't exist, or actually they want it all, and actually you can't be everything to everyone. How do you, if you like, when you are in these, I guess, moments of where you need peak performance, right? When you're on a stage, where you're running a course, when you're coaching an individual, these are moments you've got to be at your best. At the same time, and I would say, just to be really clear, I would say this to a man or a woman: you have children. So I'd say it to myself: I have a child, you have children. You have responsibilities and passions. How do you find the right sort of combination so you can craft the best life possible, whilst also making sure, bluntly, there isn't a lot of collateral damage around you outside work?
Well, having pursued work with tons of collateral damage, I would say, I feel like I have a much better sense of the balance now. And I don't think that that's something that required me to be in this portfolio position. But for some reason, it was very difficult for me to say no at work, and to understand that I needed to do that much more in the corporate setting I was in.
Right.
And I could have done that. I could have had better boundaries, and I absolutely loved my work. And that was part of the problem, is that I always loved my work. So I may not be able to say it super well, because I haven't done it while in a big corporation. And it sounds to me like it's a bit what you're talking about. Of course, that my team, my small team now, might disagree, but having feedback, I would say, being open to feedback, is
saying it straight.
a way to understand that. So I have worked with a lot of CEOs and wondered at some of the way that they talk about those ideals. Like, we are super flexible, and they themselves have their own appetites for hobbies or cooking or sports or whatever it is. And I've been impressed by some of them. I think that it's pretty clear who's walking the talk, because
Good.
that all of their staff are doing it too. It's not like the leader with a fabulous life and the staff that stays till
like
10
slaves.
p.m.
Yeah.
So and I think that people are demanding that now a little bit more.
Yes, I agree. And they have if you're lucky enough, many of those people will have choices. If they don't like it and they don't want to work in that environment, they'll do it themselves, or they'll move elsewhere. So my last question, Diana, this has been an enriching, stimulating conversation, I have to say. What is your biggest hope for next year?
My biggest hope for next year is that we can come together again. As an American living in Hong Kong, I feel like it's been a couple of years of, the country I come from has been divided. The country that I live in has been divided from its mother country, which is in conflict with my home country. So it just feels like there's a lot of, partisanship without a lot of reaching across the aisle for understanding. And as somebody who came to Asia on a Henry Luce Foundation grant for global understanding, it's really near and dear to my heart. So for the last 20 years in Asia, I've always tried to put extra time into opportunities to make that a closer, better relationship. So that would be my hope for 2020.
That's a beautiful hope. That's very moving. I've loved this conversation. I love spending time with you. You move beautifully between and smoothly between the macro to the micro, to the near term to the future, from professional to personal. That's rare. And no wonder you're having so much success and clearly enjoying it along the way. Thank you ever so much, Diana, for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. If you like it, please show your appreciation and have a look at the other interviews in the series. Thank you.